Now that we've made those two new parts, we can start to make stage 12. As usual, we'll start with a small substage, so make sure you've got the parts that you need open. We should have the axle, the large bush, and the axle joint. I'm going to go to the axle, and I'm going to go to File, Make Assembly from Parts. I'm going to pin the Insert Components menu open, and then I'm going to insert the axle first. So that's fixed to the origin. It doesn't matter that it's the wrong size, we'll fix that in a moment, but first we'll insert the rest of the parts. I'm also going to insert one more axle. I'm going to spin that around to the correct orientation. And then the axle joint, and that should be in this kind of orientation. Again, it doesn't matter if you don't get these exactly right because you can rotate them around when you're adding the mates. And then finally, I'm going to insert that large bush as well, and I'm going to spin it around like this. And the end with the cuts should be facing downwards like this. It should be facing outwards from the screen. But again, you can spin that around later on if you need to. Now let's make these axles the correct length. Start with the fixed one, we'll make that 7 long. Click on the part and then from the drop down, choose the 7 long configuration. So it should be the one that's yellow in color. And then for this one at the top, we can click on it and that should be 3 long. Then we can just mate our parts together as usual. Let's select a circular face on the axle joint and then a similar circular face on the axle. Let's make those concentric and lock the rotation. If you find that your parts aren't lined up properly, you might need to select a flat face on the axle and a flat face on the joint and then make those parallel. And then for the position of the axle joint, I'm just going to drag it out so we can see inside it. Then I'm going to select this inside face at the top and then also select this top face of the axle and I'm going to make those coincident just so they're touching. Next, I'm going to make this large bush concentric with the axle joint. I'm going to lock the rotation again. Then I'm just going to drag it down and I'm going to make those two faces coincident so that they're touching. So as I mentioned, the end with the cuts should be facing down to the open end of the axle. It doesn't really matter too much if you get it the other way around, but that's just what the instructions say. And then finally, let's select that small axle and let's make that concentric with the axle joint. We can lock the rotation and then we can move it to the middle and we can mate it in place using the plane that goes down the middle of the axle and also the one down the middle of the assembly. So we should have something like this. We've got the large axle, then on top of it we've got the axle joint with a small axle going through it, and then underneath that we've got that large bushing just as a spacer. We can then save this sub-assembly. And this one should be called stage 12. We can now go back to the main assembly and insert this sub-assembly. Let's use Control and Tab, and then let's go to Insert Components. We'll find that latest stage 12 and insert that sub-assembly. The axle goes through this hole here. Rotate your model around and select that hole, and then also choose a circular face on the axle and make those concentric. Now we don't need to lock the rotation for these because we actually want this axle to spin round, and this is how the helicopter blades rotate. Then let's just set the height, so let's choose this top face and then the corresponding face on the bottom of the bush, and let's make those coincident so they're touching each other. So you should see that this new stage 12 assembly can spin around within that hole. Now if we look at the instructions, there's also another gear that goes in this gap here. In real life we have to insert this as we slide the axle through, but in SolidWorks we can just add it afterwards. To add that extra gear, let's copy one of the existing ones. So hold down Control, left click and drag from an existing gear, and then release to add that new part. First I'm just going to rotate it to about the right orientation. You can do this by holding down the right mouse button and dragging the part around. Then let's select one of these circular inside faces and a corresponding one on the axle, and let's make those concentric. Now we do want to lock the rotation, but you'll probably find that your axle and your gear aren't quite lined up like this. So to fix this, let's just choose a flat face inside the gear, and then also a corresponding flat face on the axle, and let's make those parallel. We can then just move this gear up to the correct position. So let's put it in the middle here somewhere, and let's just select this upper face of the gear and the lower face of the beam here, and let's make those coincident. So at this stage, these two gears aren't meshed together properly, so they don't actually affect each other, but that's something we'll fix once we've made the whole assembly. But for now, you can save your assembly and stage 12 is complete.